Thank you very much for that introduction and a huge welcome to everybody. As Kate says, I'm Roger Mortlock and I'm the National CEO for CPRE, and it's a real pleasure. I've been following these Dorset planning conferences with real, mostly on playback. So I'm very, very pleased to be here in the sort of flesh. And they've covered such incredibly important topics, from design to affordable homes to how do we build net zero homes. But perhaps today we cover a subject that is closest to my heart, which is how do we get the balance right between planning and nature. So really exciting evening to be here. I must say, I am dialing in from Gloucestershire, but I must say that Dorset is probably one of my favourite counties. It's the home of my in-laws, which might not sound like it would be my favourite, but it is certainly the place where I go to do lots of wildlife spotting. So when I think of Dorset, I often think of wildlife. So it's a particularly appropriate place to have this conference. We've got some fantastic speakers this evening from Dorset Wildlife Trust, from Wessex Water, from the landscape planning community, and from the leaders of both Dorset Council and Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council. So a real panel to get our teeth into, and as Kate said, an important opportunity for you to be logging those questions for our panelists as we go through the evening. I want to start on a slightly sad note because we were to be joined by Malcolm Tait and Kiera Chapman, two remarkable academics working at the University of Sheffield and the University of Oxford, working with wild justice on really understanding some of the issues we're going to be looking at today, particularly from the point of how they impact people. And very, very tragically, while on holiday in Greece, Malcolm fell ill and very sadly died. So neither of them will clearly be with us this evening, but I'm so pleased that Imogen from Dorset Wildlife Trust is standing in to give what they would have said together later in after the break. So, and our thoughts go to the family, an awful thing. I wanted to start with a few comments of my own, if I may. And one of the things we talk about in planning all the time is the planning balance. And so I was very pleased to see balance in the title of this conference. And there's something very important about balance and about the purpose of planning. And you might think, reading the newspaper at the moment, that the purpose of planning is to solely build more homes or is to power growth for the nation. And I think neither are true. And I think one of the things that CPRE has campaigned for since the start of the sort of the planning legislation as we know it, when if we go back to the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, CPRE had an incredibly important role. And one of the things I think we held dear, and I hope we've held dear ever since, has been the importance of taking into account the glories of the countryside and the glories of the national world alongside the needs that us humans have in that context. So I'm going to talk a little bit about perhaps the balance between nature and planning. And one of the things that we're going to hear a lot about this evening is how do we balance those needs for nature and what are the needs for planning as well. So nature first. Because I think it's fair to say nature's in free fall, and despite the fact that I come to Dorset to see wildlife, nature's also in free fall in Dorset, and we've seen shocking losses across the country since we started recording in the 1970s, really well documented in reports like The State of Nature. So really 1 in 5 species disappearing, but perhaps even more shocking, that kind of sense of abundance. I think we've all got those stories when we spoke to my grandmother talks about disturbing plumes of marbled white butterflies on the outskirts of London. You know, I think when I was growing up, I can remember, huge numbers of sparrows. So it's the abundance as well as the number of species that we're losing that feels so shocking at the moment. And just on those targets, so the target that we're focused on, including the government, is this target of 30 by 30 by 30% of our land in this country being looked after for nature's benefit by 2030. Now, that's an incredibly ambitious target because in most parts of the country, we're well under 10. And even when you've got very high percentages of protected landscapes, as you're lucky enough to have in Dorset, there's still a challenge to go. Not just because an area is protected, it doesn't mean it's doing the most it could do for nature. And I'm sure Imogen will pick up on some of that later. So as I mentioned, Dorset is one of the most wildlife rich areas in the world. You've got over 50% of it protected in national landscapes. But as we'll hear, that doesn't mean that everything's happy camping in terms of how it's impacting on nature. And essentially, I think one of the things we will also hear about is how some of the building blocks for nature, our soils, our rivers, the health of our seas, they're also struggling. And without those building blocks, I think we're seeing even more challenges for nature to thrive. And so there are many reasons for nature's decline, and we'll touch on them today, the way we farm, climate change. But today we're particularly focusing on the loss of habitat that allows nature to move around and to thrive. And it's worth reminding ourselves that every year we lose about 17,000 hectares of land, of greenfield land, to development. So it's an area roughly the size of Manchester. So if you just kind of begin to process that and what that means every year in terms of habitat loss, sure, there are other things that are impacting on wildlife decline, but development is a significant one. One of the statistics when I'm making the case to politicians that I'm often told about is that, oh, but Roger, only 2% of the country is built on. And there is, the exact footprint of buildings is around 2% in England. But the amount that is either concreted or surfaced over a natural environment is nearer 10. And I think we all know that if you see the impact of a lit road through a sort of undisturbed countryside has much more of an impact than just the footprint of the road itself. So the impacts on the tranquility of the countryside and of the ability for wildlife to thrive in that countryside are hugely impacted by where we put the things we need as humans to travel around, to live, and to service ourselves. But to end on a bright note on the nature one, we did some polling. It's our centenary year this year, and we did some polling at the beginning of the year. And 84% of people think that we can protect the countryside and build homes at the same time. And I think that's true. I spent quite a big chunk of my career when I was working at the Wildlife Trust, developing a project called Building with Nature that shows that you can do both. And I'm sure we'll have some of that hope as well as some of the challenges in our talks today. But just alongside that, I just want to quickly look at the challenges around development. And then again, we've got another target, the target that you will have all heard of, about a target to build 1.5 million homes. I would argue that unlike the nature targets, this is not a target that's based on any evidence of need. It's a political target. I don't doubt that we've got a housing crisis in this country. But it's largely a crisis of people trying to get onto the housing ladder. It's a crisis of social and affordable homes. It's not a crisis of the homes that the housing developers favour, which is building on greenfield sites. We don't have a shortage of executive four-bedroom homes with double garages. We have a shortage of homes that allow people to get on the housing ladder. We've also, as CPRE has demonstrated in our annual survey of brownfield sites, got room on brownfield land for 1.4 million homes. Now, before Imogen kind of castigates me and tells me that brownfield, she is quite right. Brownfield land can also be fantastic for nature, but in many cases, brownfield land is the ideal place to build new homes. We've also got, and we're going to hear quite a lot about planning and planners in the course of today, we've got about 1 million homes with planning permission that are, where the challenge is whether they're built out. So one of the things we'll be thinking about is, how can, just getting planning permission is not enough. We want to think about how do we get those homes built and in the right place. One thing I will just mention that has been a particular issue with this administration, with this government, has been a change that has been made to what's called the standard method. So that's the algorithm for where homes need to get built. And again, I would argue this is a very political figure. It's a figure that says that it's basically based on an uplift of existing homes. And it's really hit rural areas like Dorset hard. So I would think that there's a real challenge, I think, where rural areas, and we'll hear when we hear from the leaders of the councils later, that they're dealing with quite a big increase in the housing numbers they're needing to find without any evidence, I would argue, of need those all of those homes are needed. There are some good things on the horizon as well, and we'll hear some of that, I'm sure, as well in the course of the evening. The development of local nature recovery strategies, the development recently, the government has announced the development of a land use framework, the return of some strategic thinking about planning. All these things are good, but too often they're trumped by this rush to for developers jumping in with speculative development in particular, to make sure in putting proposals for homes in the wrong place. So these are the things that we're going to be unpacking in the course of today. Your input is going to be critical. So I'll come to the Q&A button in a second, but I want to start where I end where I started, on balance. And I think the planning tool is one of the most important tools we've got to get this right. Planning is not about just building homes. It's about building places and communities and places where people can thrive. Nature is not a luxury about that, and planning needs to think about how it thinks about nature as much as it thinks about where it puts homes. So I'm going to get us going with an introduction from Imogen Davenport from Dorset Wildlife Trust about the state of nature in Dorset now. But before I do that, just a reminder, so through the whole of the presentations, if you can't see the Q&A button, you might see 3 dots when you hover on the bottom bar of your screen. And if you press more, you'll find the Q&A button there. But if you go and put your questions and answers then, hold on to them and we'll come to them at the end.